Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony FX30. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with this camera, it is the most affordable member of Sony's cinema line. It is not a full-frame camera, it is an APS-C 26 megapixel sensor under the hood that delivers all of the same video features as its more expensive sibling, the FX3 that I use exclusively here on my channel. You can see right here, this is the FX3, nearly $4,000 US compared to the $1,799 or $2,199 if you opt to get the optional XLR handle bundle. So is this camera worth its sub $2,000 price point? The simple answer is yes. If you need a cinema tool like this, you aren't going to beat it. Great autofocus performance, really, I would say overall performance excellent. Great body handling. I love that it has the exact same build quality as the, again, far more expensive FX3. That to me is one of the best parts outside of the actual image quality that it produces. Of course, no EVF, but we do have a display here that has 2.3 million dots as opposed to the 1.4 million dots in the more expensive FX3. That's just a product of this being a newer camera. We have all of the same tally lights so that you know that you're hot, aka recording. You've got one here. I mean, you even have the record button just like the FX3 built onto the front. They've just given you so many options, in my opinion, to know where to look on this camera. But the FX3 already had, in my opinion, the most desirable body, oddly enough, of any Sony camera, in my opinion. So now to have it on a much more affordable video tool that is nearly as competent as the FX3, Sony definitely threw us a bone with this, in my opinion. So all of the I/O is exactly the same also as the FX3. Another thing Sony didn't have to do, but they did, and it's phenomenal. So full-size HDMI out, of course, that's clean HDMI out. We also have the good old multi-port, aka micro USB, still in style on this camera at least, but I do believe that is now totally phased out with the launch of the ZVE1 Type-C port, and then of course audio jacks for monitoring as well as a line-in for recording. Don't forget that this camera, just like the FX3, those quarter 20 mounts are all over it, basically making this thing a cage, on its body. So you don't need a cage. Of course, I still recommend one. And then when it comes to your storage options, the exact same layout and functionality of the much more expensive FX3 yet again. So you want to use a compact flash Type A card like this Pro Grade or the 1 terabyte Angelbird that I use predominantly now since I got that, you're good to go. And remember, this camera, goes all the way up to 4K 120, 240 frames in HD. Because of that APS-C sensor, you are going to, deal with more noise, less low light performance capability than the more expensive FX3, but I certainly don't see that as a reason for those of you who don't need low light performance to opt for the FX3. So let's be really clear. If you're shooting predominantly in shooting in a studio like myself, then this is going to serve you, for the most part, just as well as that more expensive FX3. Now, it does have, just the nature of this 26 megapixel new sensor that Sony incorporated into it, it does experience more rolling shutter. But again, if you're on a tripod in a studio, I don't see that being an issue. Then again, if you're on a gimbal shooting a lot of motion, that is going to become apparent very quickly. Something else that actually is a benefit of the APS-C sensor is that this camera shoots 6K and then downsamples it to 4K. Because after all, that's a 26 megapixel sensor, much more resolution than you need for 4K. So essentially it's going into a Super 35 mode to grab that 4K resolution, and it actually has more information in its 4K capture than a typical 4K capture from, again, its more expensive full frame sibling. So something that I think is absolutely worth pointing out. It is an actual benefit of the FX30 that I think most people do not expect, and I completely understand why. So again, less low light performance, rolling shutter, but you're getting more resolution up until you hit 4K 60. Once you get to 4K 60, now you are going to see less performance from this camera. Of course, the peak of less performance compared to the FX3 being hitting that 4K 120, but you're still getting 10-bit video out of this. The LUTs, whatever you prefer, color profiles, you have log. I mean, this really performs just as the FX3, but at nearly half the price. Again, with a better LCD screen, what is there not to like? Battery life, very similar, and they do take the exact same battery, for those of you that are wondering. Nothing different there, and that's a good thing. I mean, I would love to see Sony introduce a new battery type, since we've been working with these Z-series batteries now for a long time. I remember when they launched like it was yesterday, and I was so happy, but it's time for something new, Sony. I'll be the first to say it. And don't forget that this did just get a massive firmware update that also went to the FX3. So we got DCI 4K, we got anamorphic de-squeeze, we also got breathing compensation. These are all great things that people didn't necessarily expect. They wanted them, and Sony just dropped it on this, you know, I'll call it affordable cinema body. You know, a lot of people have been complaining about Sony's firmware support. Well, I think dropping an update like that on this camera is part of that reason. People don't like seeing it, and I get it. You know, cameras that are inexpensive compared to their A7S III or their A1 getting features they would like to have. But I'll remind you, this is part of the cinema line. That is why Sony did what they did. I'm not defending them. That's just their roadmap, and it makes sense even if we don't like it. So again, great performance in this camera, so much, I mean, in terms of features, overall capability. And then when it comes to the autofocus performance, eye autofocus, real-time tracking, it's right there with the FX3 yet again. Now, when it comes to still mode, they are actually using the exact same number of points of autofocus detection, they being the FX3 and the 30. But when it comes to video, the FX3 does have more points, over 700 as opposed to over 600 here in the 30. But I have to tell you, in real world use, shooting with this, I really didn't detect any true performance difference between, again, the nearly half the price FX30 and the nearly double the price FX3. So again, the difference between the two of them, you know, narrowing even more. So let's talk about lenses, because I think that's the next thing that is critical if you're considering buying one of these glass, because there is a crop factor. This is an APS-C sensor, so that means when you throw something like this lens, which is the full frame 16 to 35 PZ, it's the G series lens, which I think is an amazing piece of glass for the price. It is full frame. That means popping it on here, you still have a nice light setup with a power zoom with a great range, but that crop factor slaps you in the face immediately. Now, for some of you, that crop factor is going to be a blessing, because you can't accomplish that with the FX3 because it's full frame and it's shooting using the entire sensor, except in 4K 120, where there's a crop factor of 1.1, which is nearly nil. Here, this instantly makes this 1.5, and if you shoot 4K 120, it's actually going to be 1.6. So keep that in mind. So truly, this 16 to 35, you know, ends up being like a 24 to 52, if my math serves. So something around there. So it's just something to be aware of. So if you want more reach, this will give it to you, whereas the FX3 can't natively do that. But again, low light, dynamic range, that will go to the FX3. That's just one of, or two of those inherent things that with its sensor, it will outperform this camera, and that is to be expected. But again, good lighting, controlled lighting, studio environments, you're going to see this perform just as well, and sometimes possibly better. Like I said, under 4K 60, that 4K 24 and 30 frames, you may actually see more detail in your image than you would from the full frame FX3. So that's a big compliment to a camera that's roughly half the cost. But when it comes to lenses, again, your APS-C lineup, generally more affordable, generally smaller. Sony has launched a lot of full-frame glass that is a lot smaller. I covered it a few years back. And those are nice lenses that will adapt here and work well. Not as many power zoom options. I think in total APS-C, I think Sony has 3 or 4 that are, again, APS-C, not full frame like this or my 28 to 135, which are great lenses. But again, I think that if you've got this and you're buying new glass, generally I say buy the full frame glass because it's more flexible. And yes, if you're comfortable with that crop factor, go ahead and get the full frame glass. If you do not want that crop factor and you do not own any Sony full frame cameras and you do not plan to purchase any full frame bodies that Sony makes, then I say go APS-C crazy. There are third-party lenses, cinema lenses that are great buys, and they're going to save you a ton of money. I mean, generally speaking, when you go to cinema third-party glass, it's going to be a third or half the price of the full frame option. And putting the full frame glass here isn't going to afford you any new capability. If anything, again, crop factor, and then, it's really, in my opinion, not a worthwhile game to get caught up in. So there's a lot to like with the FX30. Again, the body being identical to the FX3, overall capability nearly identical. I mean, on paper, it's identical. You're getting that same 10-bit capability across the board, all the way up to 4K 120, again, 240 HD in slow-mo. That is not going to be as good as the FX3, but it's still going to be really good. You're getting all the same I/O. You're getting the exact same battery, the exact same, SD card slot / compact flash express type A card slots with redundancy, proxy capability. I mean, it really checks every box you could possibly want, especially if, like me, you love the body on the FX3. Now you have a much more affordable way to get it in your hands. And look, some people will say, they have a wish list. They wish that there were more features. I get it. That will always be the case. Nothing is perfect, especially not any camera you're going to buy. But it could be perfect for your needs. And I think that as a customer that purchased the FX3 thinking it was perfect for my needs, I know looking back on this, and you'll get some of that if you watch my comparison of these two cameras, I really wish that this was out at the same time as the FX3. It would have made my decision much more difficult because they are so similar in terms of body and overall performance. Of course, the sensor is the key difference. And for the price difference, I have to say, even though I own a vast majority of full frame glass, which would lead me towards the FX3, so that this way I'm not buying new APS-C lenses, the fact of the matter is the FX30 is so much less expensive that I easily see 2, even possibly 3 pieces of glass in that extra, savings if I wanted to start all over. So there's a lot to like here. Again, don't forget about the oversampled 6K downsampled to 4K. That's going to be a nice feature of this as opposed to the FX3. Don't forget that the FX3 is the low light champion, but everybody knows that. It's got the same sensor as the A7S3, and that's what the A7S line was always known for. Some people get hung up on it really being where Sony's video chops began, but that means you don't realize that Sony's been behind most of what you've watched on television for the majority of your life in terms of that capture process. And those cameras, and really the A7S3, I feel like was an accidental video machine that Sony designed really just to be the low light monster, and well, that's why it eventually became this in one way or another, the FX3 and the FX30. Granted, this is not that sensor, but it's part of that roadmap of how we got to great video cameras in Sony's lineup of full frame and APS-C mirrorless cameras. So the FX30 is a winner. I easily can recommend this. Again, if you're thinking about what glass to invest in, I would stick with the APS-C stuff, even though, as I said earlier, I generally recommend going full frame so that you have something that's easily adaptable. But the advantages of APS-C glass, again, for the most part being smaller, lighter, and more affordable, that's a win-win with a more affordable FX3. And that's exactly what the FX30 is. Again, autofocus performance essentially being the same, the tracking being the same. You know, if the biggest gripe with this is the rolling shutter on fast movement, and again, the lack of FX3 performance in low light, what is there to think about? This is a monster. And then if you're doing paid work with this, unlike the ZV-E1, remember, we've got active cooling here. And that to me is an absolute must-have for anyone that is relying on this for paid assignment work. You do not want a camera that could potentially overheat simply because you opted for something that was a little bit cuter. And I'm not saying that the ZV-E1 is cuter. Literally, I think you get my drift. I mean, this is all business, whereas the ZV-E1 is, well, whatever you want it to be. You know, when a client sees these cameras, they're not going to know the difference between them, which means that you can easily walk on with your $1,800 instead of $3,900 investment, and they're also not going to really see a difference in the final product. And God knows how focused clients can be, myself included, on the rare instances that I am a client, on what gear is being used. Now, I'm not one of the people that would be fooled by these two, but here's the cool part. Let's say for my wedding, had my wedding videographer come out with the FX30, I wouldn't have been disappointed. He did shoot it with the A7S III, but had he had the FX30, I wouldn't have said, oh, that could be the FX3. I would have said, that's the FX30, and I'm happy with that, except for the low light situations. We would have had to have a talk about that. But because, you know, he had the A7S III, there were no issues. But keep in mind, he was filming on an f4 lens. So these are the things people have to think about. You know, it's really your use case, and the good news about the FX30 is I think it can really deliver on most situational shooting, even run and gun, in spite of its rolling shutter issues. And then, you know, where you have to make up for what it can't do, I think you'll be all right. And that's to say that this is just that good of a camera, and Sony was really smart to make it. I would take this all day, every day over the ZV-E1, even though I haven't tested it yet. Again, if it's for paid assignment work. Even for my YouTube channel, I think this is ideal. I think if that's what you're after, you're going to be really happy with this. But for YouTube work, that ZV-E1 may be a better option, just because of the AI and what that provides, the stabilization. It's really designed to be a vlogging camera and an influencer camera rather than a cinema tool, and hopefully that comes across. And remember, the active cooling also only found on the FX3. That was one of the main reasons I went with it. And then when it comes to the menu system, you are getting the exact same menu system, I don't have a battery in here, as the vastly more expensive, as you already know, FX3. So again, blurring that line of differentiation between these two cameras to a point where you can easily make the argument that there isn't a reason for the FX3 unless you just have an abundance of full-frame glass and don't want to make the switch, or again, that crop factor is your nightmare. And I think that's what it really boils down to, is that you need to know which is which. You know, remember, you've got that touchscreen capability. This is why, to me, the FX30 is such a star. I mean, there is so little to differentiate it from the FX3 outside of, again, the things I continuously point to, and so does everyone else on planet Earth: rolling shutter, low light performance, and even dynamic range is so close. I mean, one stop difference between the two, obviously going to the favor of the full-frame FX3, but that is just amazing. So just another thing to be aware of that, in my opinion, is a flex for the FX30, making its case for being the best affordable cinema camera here in 2023. So this review unit is going back to Sony. I will miss it because, again, this is a perfect B camera for me. So I may have to add it down the road, and who knows, it could become an A camera, but I'll probably be waiting for what Sony does as a sequel to this camera or the FX3, because once we combine these elements of ergonomics and overall construction quality and cooling to a camera that does incorporate the new AI processing units that Sony's dropping into everything, that is going to change the game on these cameras as well. But for right now, the FX30 should satisfy the majority of you, especially if you're on a budget or if you prefer to work with APS-C lenses. Because remember, if you take an APS-C lens off of this and throw it on a full-frame camera like the FX3, you won't be able to shoot 4K with it, because it will be shooting Super 35 cropped on a sensor like this, which will not yield enough resolution for 4K. Now, if you throw an APS-C lens onto something like the A7R2, 3, 4, or 5, because those sensors have so much resolution, you can shoot 4K Super 35 on those cameras. So even with something as old as my good old golden A7R2, it's going to work out. Or my A1, if I throw an APS-C lens on my A1, I will get a Super 35 product. That's just not going to happen on the FX3. So it's something to be aware of, since we are specifically talking about two cinema tools that share so much in common, except for their actual sensor type. But again, Sony did an amazing job. You are not going to be disappointed with this camera as long as you understand its strengths and weaknesses. Not many weaknesses. It's just really dealing with that crop factor and rolling shutter, which I think is a bit of a bullshit anyway, because, you know, to induce rolling shutter, you really have to be on a gimbal or doing incredibly quick pans. And if you know that, you generally can work around it. And one last thing I'll point out, still capture on this. Now, you have a 26 megapixel sensor, which is certainly better than the full frame 12 megapixel sensor, but with the base ISO here being so much lower, we again are reminded of, you know, the fact that low light will not be a strong suit for this camera, not that you expected it in a still sense, and the FX3 will outperform it, even though they have the exact same number of detection points for autofocus. The still performance, in my opinion, is just so much better on the FX3 because of that sensor. Remember, a lot of people think that the A7S line was always a video line, and that's just bogus. That is not what it was. It was a low-light still line that evolved into a video tool over time, and some people are going to argue with me about that, but the thing is, you won't really be arguing with me because I won't necessarily interface with you, right? Some people are looking for echo chambers, and I will not provide that ever. That's a guarantee. So again, this is just a phenomenal piece of kit, and I would sooner look to this for video needs than probably anything on the market, just because of the price to performance capability on this camera. That ratio is insane. And again, this is my favorite lens. You can still use it with it. Just remember that crop factor. And since I kind of despise the crop factor thing, it would be something I would have to permanently get adjusted to. But for that savings, I think that I could definitely swallow that pill. I would not want to buy all new glass though. I just have too many full frame lenses that I love and that I predominantly use on my A1, of course, and my FX3. So it would be a shakeup for me in this studio and in this life. But overall, again, solid battery life, no overheating, great video quality, decent still quality, which is totally not even secondary, maybe tertiary. What is there not to like about the FX30? You know, not much. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe and please stay safe. Later.